Hello and welcome to a Back to Jerusalem live podcast. Some of you will be listening to this live, some will be downloading it from our website at backtojerusalem.com/podcast. If you are one of the people that are listening to this live, welcome. If you're listening to this through our podcast, we are so thankful that you continue to download our podcast. This is going to be a longer podcast. So if you only have a couple of minutes, this might be one that you want to put aside till later, because what I'm going to be sharing, I believe, is a pretty explosive report and kind of exclusive. Now, the information I'm going to be sharing can be found in other places as well, but not compiled in the way that you will find in this report. This report, I think, is going to be something that is unique. And I think that it's going to be something that people around the world will be able to hear, learn from, and pray about. Now, when we think of Wuhan, when we think of the city of Wuhan, a lot of people for the very first time heard about Wuhan as it relates to the coronavirus. But there is a history that I believe is one that needs to be shared. It's information that most people are not aware of. And just because I live in China, I'm a little bit more familiar with what's taking place. And for this podcast, get comfortable wherever you're at, take a seat, because it's going to be a bit of a ride. And for those of you that don't like history, you're going to hate this podcast, because I'm going to be dabbling in some history, because without the history, there is absolutely no context for you to understand what's happening today. Because what's taking place, or what took place in Wuhan, the secrets that kind of originated in Wuhan, I believe has led to the violence that we are seeing in the streets today. Now, in order to fully share with you about what's happening today, I'm going to ask you for a second to come with me as I share a little bit about the history of China. Most people don't know much about the history of China, and I promise this is not going to be a boring lecture. I'm biased, all right? I love history, but I have put together my notes in a way, and I've been studying about this for a while, and I've been kind of gnawing on how do I share this? How do I share this in a way that keeps people engaged? Because the information is important. But if I get too long-winded, I know that I'm going to lose much of my audience. So that is why I decided to do this as a podcast instead of writing it as an article. I started to write the article, just my notes alone are about 15 pages of 12-point font. So I am going to touch on some parts of Chinese history that you may not know about or have even heard about. Let me start with the Opium Wars. Now, the Opium Wars took place almost 200 years ago inside of China. And it might sound unrelatable, but the way that they weave into what's taking place today, when I started to see this connection in history, it absolutely blew me away. Because the Opium Wars are shaping not just China history. Many people refer to the Opium Wars as the beginning of modern China. It's when China went from being an empire to start moving into a country that was more engaged with other nations around it. They were very isolated prior to the Opium Wars. But it doesn't just shape Chinese history. The Opium Wars shapes your history as well, even if you don't know it. Because the crime that we are seeing in the city today, in the big cities, New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris, can be directly connected to China's Opium War. For almost 200 years, China has been feeling the humiliation of Western occupation, and now they feel a bit entitled to return to power and return that humiliation that they felt from the rest of the world. China was a rich, wealthy, massive empire and has been for much of its history. They've been feared around the world. And listen, China was more advanced than most civilizations. They were an advanced civilization when Europeans were still wearing animal skins and etching stick figures in caves. China was this shining, massive nation with huge cities complete with city planners and plumbing, waste disposal. Some of the most beautiful ornate garments came from China several hundred, even thousands of years ago. We're talking pottery, statues made from gold, silver, copper. They not only took metals and shaped them long before most of the world did, but they made them into works of art. They weren't just mere survival tools. They were also writing books, writing down their history. Their language is one of the oldest languages in the entire world, and they invented the paper needed to write their history on, when most people around the world didn't even have a written alphabet. The Chinese can trace their history back thousands of years. When Englishmen were being made slaves by the barbaric Vikings of Scandinavia, Chinese explorers were mapping massive portions of the world. When Rome in its infancy was still sipping at the teat of the she-wolf, China was a full-blown empire taking over large parts of the world. And then, bam, humiliation. And it was bad. China fell to the people that they felt were barbarians, Western civilization. It's an event with the Opium Wars that will not be soon forgotten inside of China. And China would have a revenge that's not without irony. 3 things that I want you to take away from this podcast. 1, cities. Why are cities in chaos, and what does that have to do with Wuhan? 2, free trade. The real reason why China does not trust free trade. And 3, missionaries. The missionary myth that is used in China to scare every Chinese. So those are the 3 things that I'm going to talk about during this podcast that I think are unique and shared in a way that you won't find anywhere else. Cities and why cities are in chaos and what that has to do with China and its history in Wuhan. Free trade, the real reason why Chinese do not trust free trade. And missionaries, a missionary myth that is shared inside of China to scare every Chinese. We're going to be learning about that, and it's going to, like I said, it's going to start with this Opium War. Now, if you're not familiar with the Opium War, the first Opium War, so there's kind of 2 Opium Wars. It took place over a period of time, but if you ever read about it, it'll say Opium War 1, Opium War 2. Kind of think about it as the world wars, right? You have World War 1, World War 2. China has the Opium Wars, and it shapes modern China. The first one was fought 1839 to 1842, and it basically takes place between China and Britain. And it was triggered by China's desire to stop the opium trade and Britain's desire to keep it going. The second Opium War was for the same reason, except this time, instead of just fighting Britain, France jumped in because there was so much to gain. And that took place only 14 years later. So these are 2 wars that took place pretty close to one another. You know what? Before I go to the Opium Wars, let me go back even further, as if I can dig back into history even more. But this is so important. For you as the listener, this might be information that your history class has skipped. This is information that is leading to the tearing down of monuments around the world. This is information that the the protesters do not know. This is information that the protest leaders want to keep young people, university professors want to keep their students from knowing. Newscasts want to keep you from understanding. So if we go back just a little bit further to Christopher Columbus, right? Because he's the one that has been said to explore the waters and discover America, right? And his statue was just torn down in big cities in America. I think it was torn down in Boston. So his statue has been the point of contingency for a while, but now it's come to a point where many protesters are just going after this guy because they see him as an invader. They see him as someone who owns slaves. They see him as an individual who came and brought his culture, disease, and slavery to the indigenous people of America. China also views him that way. And that's why I'm bringing him up. Because if you don't know why Christopher Columbus did the exploration, you miss what the protesters don't want you to know. Because, first of all, Christopher Columbus was not the first person to discover America. All right, he was the first person that's kind of credited because it brought value to the entire world. When Christopher Columbus discovered America, it brought value to the entire world, and I'm about to tell you why. Because he wasn't the first person to discover America. In fact, the Chinese know that they discovered it first. You know, we always say in school, right? Christopher Columbus in 1940 or 1492 sailed the ocean blue. That's kind of our rhyme that we learn in school to be able to tell us the year that Christopher Columbus discovered America, 1492. But the Chinese actually discovered America half a century earlier in 1421. But the truth is if you're going to see who really explored America as an explorer, as a European, before the indigenous people actually made their way, because I mean, somebody had to, discovery is kind of up for debate, right? Wouldn't it be the people that were here first or in America first that were the actual people that discovered it? Most people do not know this. But the discovery of America was done in the 1st century. And we actually celebrate, there's a holiday in America that celebrates this. And most people are completely unaware. This is why so many people are protesting Christopher Columbus, because they don't understand history. September 2nd, 1964. The United States Congress passed a joint resolution. The joint resolution is known as 88566. And it authorized President at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, to proclaim October 9th as Leif Erikson Day. Remembering that it was he, Leif Erikson, the explorer, that discovered America in the fall of 999. That's party like it's 999, right? So is Leif the son of Eric the Red. Now, you may not want to hear this or may not care about this because it doesn't sound interesting to you, but this is so important. I know you might be asking, what does this have to do with China? Just follow me for a second. Stay with me in this wagon. I promise it's going to pay off. Because Leif was the son of a guy by the name of Eric the Red. And Eric the Red and his father were banished from the Viking community because he and his father were pretty violent, and they killed some people, and they were sent into exile into Greenland. Greenland, which is known as Greenland today, most people say, why is it that Iceland is green and Greenland is ice? Well, the reason why is because when banishment happened to Eric the Red, he was a great salesman and said, you know what? It doesn't bother me. This is great out here. This is wonderful. This land is so fertile. We're going to call it Greenland. And it encouraged a lot of people to come and join them in Greenland into their first kind of population, because they believed that they actually had longer summers there and it was much more productive than it was in Iceland or Norway. But the son of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, the person that discovered America, went back to Norway, met with the Christian king of Norway. And the Christian king anointed him to be a part of the royal guard. And the king sent Leif out to be a missionary to Greenland, to preach about Jesus to his father, Eric the Red, and all of those in the new community of Greenland. And he went, and there was a storm, and they ended up hitting Newfoundland in an area that they call Vinland, which can either mean windy land or the land of grapes. And we know that grapes were brought over from Newfoundland to Iceland. And so there were a lot of stories shared about America at that time. And this was actually discovered in 1978. Scientists found that there was a Viking community, the only one in North America is still surviving. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but this is the place where Leif Erikson came and preached the gospel to American Indians. This directly relates to me in some small way because my family immigrated from Germany and became indentured servants so that they could preach the gospel to American Indians. They were a part of what we call the Waldensian groups. They left from Germany. They didn't have money to pay for their passage to America, but they had a calling by God to preach to the Indians. And so they set up an area in the Indian territory called the Second Germana. And my family was a part of that Second Germana and used that as their base to go and preach to the Munsee Indian tribe, which is where I grew up. I grew up very close to a place called Muncie, which is by the Munsee, that was named after the Munsee Indian tribe. True story. Both Leif Erikson and my family history. But when we look at the days of Christ, Europe, all the way back to the days of Christ, Europe has always had open trading with China. That directly relates to back to Jerusalem because we have what's called the Silk Road. And the Silk Road is where the back to Jerusalem missionaries take the gospel from China all the way back to the Middle East, or in that 1040 window. Their goal was to go all the way back to Europe, and they did. And the Europeans loved those goods. And that is how the first missionaries actually came to China, by the way. We just did a quiz, a trivia show. We always do it every Friday on dingdash.com. If you haven't gone to dingdash.com, I highly encourage you, go to Dingdash, sign up, get a free account. There you will find Christians from all around the world. And every Friday on Dingdash, we do a trivia night where we give out free books for people that answer questions correctly. Now, we asked a question on last Friday about, we showed a picture of the oldest church in China. Think about this as the listener. How old do you think the oldest church in China is today? 100 years old? If it was 100 years old, that would be older than the country itself. China is only like 70 years old. Started in 1949. So you have a country that if a church is 100 years old, it's actually older than the country itself. The Republic of China was founded in 1949. But it's older than 100 years. 400 years? If it's older than 400 years, that means it's older than America. And yes, the oldest church in China is older than 400 years. 1,000 years. If it's older than 1,000 years, that means that the church in China, if it is indeed, and it is older than 1,000 years, it's older than most countries in Europe. It's older than 1,000 years. The oldest church in China, which is built outside of Xi'an, is over 1,300 years old. It was built in the year 640 by Nestorian missionaries who came from Iran and preached the gospel in Xi'an, the ancient capital of China. But they couldn't go back to their home country. After they built the church, they stayed in China, they died in China, they gave their lives in China to preach the good news of Jesus Christ in China. But they could not go back. Now, for those of you that are good with history, you might know why the first missionaries to China could not return back. They couldn't return back to Europe, or they couldn't return back to Iran because of Islam. It was in the 7th century that we see the rise of Muhammad. And as Muhammad came to power, he began to run bandit groups into different areas to take over those areas of the Middle East. First, he went from Medina to Mecca, which was a complete piracy type of operation. He had armed, paid mercenary thugs. And all the caravans that they robbed that was going into Mecca, they took the surviving women and children as their slaves and sex slaves. Then they went in and took over Mecca. That's why you have the Hajj every year, going from Medina to Mecca, to remember that war type progression that went from Medina to Mecca. And then every nation that was ever taken over by Islam was done so by military takeover. Iran today, it wasn't called Iran during the days of Islam. When Islam first started, it was called the Empire of Persia. But the Islam wants to erase that history because the Muslims don't want you to think about Persia in the Bible and how God used the founder of Persia or the founder of Iran, King Cyrus, his son, his grandson Xerxes, who was married to Ruth, who was the whole book of Ruth is written about her. So when we look at Iran, Iran wasn't called Iran until the 1930s. And it only became Iran in the 1930s because of Hitler. Hitler said that Iran was the nation of Aryans, built a official relationship with the Shah. They transferred the name into Iran from Persia. It's the enemy's way of stealing the name. And so Iranians want you to think that they've always been Muslim. They haven't. They were forced into Islam. They had no more of a choice to be Muslims than a slave being a slave from their birth. When you're born into slavery as a baby, you don't have that choice. You're forced into it when you're born into it. Just like the Iranians after the 7th century were born in Iran, they were forced to be Muslims. So the Muslim empire started to take over much of the Middle East, and the Middle East was then thought of as being Muslim. This is so important because this happened in 651. That meant that the first missionaries that went into China, that went and preached the gospel in China, could not go back to their home country because it had now been transferred into a Muslim nation. And if you did not convert, you died. It was conversion by the sword. That's how Islam has grown throughout history. It's got a bloody, violent, barbaric history that most college professors would rather avoid because it doesn't translate as being very nice when you're teaching real history. But guys, that's the facts. And here is how that directly relates to Christopher Columbus and China. Because once the Middle East was taken over, that shut down the Silk Road from China to Europe. That cut off traders that were able to take that main highway back and forth and trade goods. So after the 7th century, how did goods go back and forth? Because the Europeans were addicted to Chinese goods. So how did they get those goods? They did it by sea. And so nations in Europe began to build up these huge armadas that were able to ship out from Europe. And what they did is they sailed eastward around the African Horn into Asia and East Asia to be able to do the trade and come back. Here's the problem. Islam began to take over not just the Middle East, but Africa and Europe. The Islamic armies did jihad throughout northern Africa, and it was a slaughter. Egypt used to be one of the centers for theological studies. Alexandria used to be one of the world's largest, most proud libraries. Gone, wiped off the face of the earth, because the enemy hates history. That's why the enemy wants to tear down libraries. That's why they want to destroy monuments. That's why they want to tear down statues. That's why they want to destroy history on the internet. That's why they want to do book burnings. That's why they want to monitor and police your speech. That's why they want to change your thought. That's why they want to get rid of history, because history will show how evil man is and how much in need of a redeemer we are in need of. So what you have is you have a European group of traders that want desperately to trade with China, but they cannot. Why? Because if they go through Islamic territories, through the Silk Road, they'll be captured and made into slaves. And now there is these pirates that are coming out of Africa that are taking over areas of Europe. So they took over Spain, they took over Portugal for not short periods of time. They invaded Italy, they invaded France, and they tried to take over Europe. The Muslim armies tried to take over Europe, but they were stopped in France and pushed out of Italy. And then finally, there was a pushback after a couple hundred years of taking back over the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal, and pushed the Muslims back into Africa. But then you had this four-country group of empires known as the Barbary empires and the Barbary pirates. Now, when you think of pirates, you might be thinking of Pirates of the Caribbean, right? Well, that's a fun movie, right? Everybody's rooting for the pirates. They're just these good old guys that, steal gold from time to time. No. Muslim pirates were deadly. They took over ships. Did you know that between 1 and 1.5 million Europeans were captured by Barbary pirates and sold as slaves in North Africa between the 15th and 19th century? For 400 years, Africans captured Europeans and brought them in as slaves into Africa. I bet you weren't taught that in school. Yes, slaves. I'm talking male slaves, children slaves, women slaves. Stripped down, butt booty naked, sold on the market just like African slaves were in other parts of the world, just like Middle Eastern slaves were, just like Jewish slaves were. Women were taken from Europe and given to African rulers of the Barbary states. And when I'm talking about Barbary states, I'm talking about four main countries: Algiers, Morocco, Tunis, and Tripoli. Tripoli is modern day Libya. And these four African countries took slaves not just from Europe, but from America. And so Christopher Columbus was looking for a way to be able to get trade from India and China without going through Muslim territory, because all the ships that went through those areas, all the caravans that went overland to those areas, were captured and taken as slaves. You see, the statue of Christopher Columbus doesn't just represent the ideas of a slave trader, as the protesters will have you believe. But he was somebody who looked for a way to keep from his people becoming slaves. That's why his discovery was so important, because it showed that there might be another way to start trading with Asia without going through Muslim areas where Europeans were in danger of becoming slaves. Did you know this? Did you know that the very first foreign war by America, and consequently, I'm actually doing this podcast right now from Sweden. So America's very first foreign war was together with Sweden's very last foreign war. Sweden hasn't been to war since 1800, or since the early 1800s. Now, when I say foreign war, I'm talking about outside of Scandinavia. A couple years after the Barbary Pirates War, they had battles with Finland, Denmark, Norway, border wars, even with France and England, but they weren't foreign wars in the same respect. This was Sweden's very last foreign war, was in Northern Africa. Why? And it was America's very first foreign war outside of America. Why? Because Swedish citizens and American citizens were being captured by African Muslims that were taking their passengers for slaves. Now, if you read about it in history, what they'll often say is that they'll refer to these guys as captives, and you can call them captives as well. That is also an appropriate and proper, correct term, but it would also be correct to call them slaves because they became property of their captors. And the captors didn't care whether they were sold back to their families back in Europe or America that actually paid money to get them back, or if they were sold to another slave owner in Algiers, Tunis, or Tripoli. One of the things that we see is that the slaves are property. They were for sale. either back to their country or to another slave owner, did not matter to the person taking them in as slaves, as long as the price was paid. Humans were not humans, they were property. That was the thought of the time. It wasn't just Africans, it was Europeans, it was Americans, it was Asians. But what you're told about are the slaves that were taken by Europeans and Americans, but not about the Americans and Europeans that were taken as slaves. The reason why this is important is because when we look at especially for me, right? Because I'm a former U.S. Marine. I had to learn this history in the Marine Corps. One of our main heroes, so anybody listening to this podcast that is a former U.S. Marine, you will remember that in boot camp, you had to memorize the name Presley O'Bannon. This is one of our main guys. Presley O'Bannon is the very first American soldier to ever raise the American flag over foreign soil. Never happened before. By the way, America didn't want to be at war. America did not want to be at war. It was the year 1800. We were still fighting for our independence from the Brits. We hadn't even had the War of 1812 yet, which was still with the Brits. We're still trying to maintain that independence by the year of 1800. We were a poor country, definitely not an international country. But we got tired of seeing our ships taken and our people taken as slaves. In 1790 alone, the northern Horn of Africa took at least 11 American ships full of crew members and passengers that were all made slaves. In 1803, there were 300 Navy officers that had been captured and were made slaves by Tripoli. Tripoli told us, hey, if you want these guys back, you have to pay $3 million because that's what these slaves are worth. Thomas Jefferson, before he became the president, actually traveled to London to meet with the ambassador from Tripoli and ask him, dude, why are you taking our people as slaves? We're paying you tribute. Did you know that America, when they first became a country, paid 1/5 of all of its GDP? And in the very first year had to take a loan, but every year America paid 1/5 of their GDP as a tribute to Northern Africa to keep them from taking Americans as slaves. They took the tribute and they still made Americans slaves. So Thomas Jefferson travels to London and he sits down with the ambassador from Tripoli and asks him, dude, why are you taking our people as slaves? And the ambassador from Tripoli tells him plainly that until all the infidels accept Islam, they are to be made slaves or killed by the sword. So Thomas Jefferson got a Quran and he came back to America to study the Quran, not to see what kind of wisdom he could get from the teachings, but to learn his enemy. That is the Quran that is sitting in the Smithsonian. That was the Quran that was used for the very first Muslim member of Congress, Keith Ellison, that swore in on it. Because he said, if Thomas Jefferson can learn from the Quran, maybe we all can. Yeah, he learned how to learn from his enemy. And finally, Thomas Jefferson, as the president, had enough. And what did he do? He did what many presidents after him did. He sent in the Marines. And the Marines, with a very small group under Presley O'Bannon, went in, fought the Barbary pirates, kicked butt, took names, and freed the American slaves and brought them back. There's a lot more to that history, but that's in a nutshell. Especially as a Marine, that's how I'm going to tell the story. By the way, anybody that knows the Marine Corps hymn at all, it's the most famous of all the hymns. I went through Army Ranger School. And as a Marine, we had all the Army Rangers at the school singing the Marine hymn because they didn't know the Army song. I still don't know the Army song. Had to learn it in Ranger School. I forget it. But the very first line of the Marine Corps hymn is from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Sorry, guys, I'm not going to sing it for you today. But it's to remember the very first American foreign war that was on the shores of Tripoli. And that was in Northern Africa. By the way, why does the United States Marine Corps uniform look different than all the others? If you look at the Army uniform, the Navy uniform, the Air Force uniform, they all wear suits. But the Marines have a high collar neck. Why? because our very first foreign war was in Muslim territory. Muslims believed in beheading the infidel by taking the sword and beheading the infidel. And the sword, you know, the NCOs, non-commissioned officers, are the only military NCOs in the U.S. military that's allowed to carry a sword. And the U.S. Marine officers carry a sword. It's called the Marmaluke sword. And the Marmaluke sword is a sword that is based off of the Muslim sword that was presented to Presley O'Bannon for his bravery as he fought to free American slaves out of African Muslim territory. The reason why this is important is because this goes to the heart of trade. The Europeans were not able to take their boats over the Islamic waters between the Middle East and Africa in order to do trade with China. But after the conquering of the Barbary pirates, this allowed the Brits, and the Brits paid tribute as well. It wasn't just the Americans. The Brits kind of set the standard for paying tribute to the Barbary pirates to keep their ships from being taken. But then the Brits started to become the masters of the sea. They were awesome on the sea. America could not match the Brits on the sea. They kicked butt, and they started to take their armadas to the east and do trade together with the Chinese. But this is so important. I know that this might be getting heavy for some of you. This might be getting a little boring for you. But let me just share why this is so important. You see, Europe wanted the goods from China. They needed to establish a trade route between China and Europe. And the Brits were one of the most successful at doing it. The British Empire was able to build a water route in the 1800s. After this war was finally won with the Barbary pirates, they were able to move their goods back and forth from China into England. But here's the problem. And you know, the Europeans absolutely loved the things that were coming from China. What were the things coming from China? Porcelain, tea, and silk. The Europeans were eating it up, but they couldn't pay for it. Britain couldn't pay for it because they had spent so much money trying to beat the Americans, which they lost, and they had to leave out of America in a humiliating fashion. So they didn't have a lot of money, but they still needed the goods, and there was a lot of vision to be able to bring those goods from Asia back to Europe, mainly to Britain. But the Brits were running out of silver. They couldn't pay for those goods that they wanted. So they devised a plan. They began to grow opium in Bengal. They began to bring opium from India into China. And they got the Chinese addicted to opium, and then they traded the opium for all of the goods that they wanted. Now, opium was not legal inside of China, so the Brits were working together with locals to start smuggling it in. And they began to connect with the elite people inside of China and feed the opium to them. The emperor quickly saw in the mid-1800s the damage that the opium did. Now, a lot of you people think, you're listening to this podcast and you automatically think, well, of course, opium is bad. Opium is addictive. We didn't know that in the 1800s. It was actually missionaries working in China that started to write the very first studies on the addiction level of drugs, like opium. And so there was an argument in Europe. Now, those that were doing the trade, they knew that it was addictive, but they argued against it and said, people can make up their own mind. We can bring it into England. The Brits aren't, addicted to it. The Chinese have a choice. And then the British merchants went to the Chinese emperor and basically said, listen, if you legalize opium, do you even know how much money you'll be able to make in taxes? Just tax it. It's a gold mine. You're sitting on a gold mine. You legalize it, you tax it, you make money from it, everybody's happy. But the emperor saw his people were getting addicted and they were becoming worthless. You ever see pictures? If you have never seen pictures, go onto the internet and look at the pictures of the opium dens in China, where men sat around for days, months, smoking, getting high. They didn't work. They didn't participate. They had no ambition. They weren't making money. They became thieves. They became addicted. They became worthless members of society. And the emperor didn't like this. So what the emperor of China did is he tried to negotiate with the Brits. And he said, hey, stop bringing in this opium. And the opium that you have in our country, we're not going to expect you to take a loss from it. We will destroy it, but we will give you tea in trade for all of this opium. Let's just get rid of it. You take the tea, go home, everybody's happy. But the Brits said, no, we're not stopping. So the emperor was basically pushed into a corner during the Qing dynasty. So what the emperor of China did is he gave an order to his army to go around for all opium shops, stores, dens, anybody transporting opium, any ships carrying opium, any buildings storing opium, seize them, burn them, destroy them. Any people that get in the way, arrest them. Many of the ships that was carrying opium were owned by British merchants. Many of the storage facilities were owned by British merchants. So when the emperor of China did this, he was declaring war on Britain. And it's kind of what the British merchants wanted. Because, you see, in the West had been going through an industrial revolution. And with the industrialization of the West, there was a lot of mechanics that allowed military equipment to be made more effectively, more efficiently, in much bigger numbers. So this gave just like, a couple of people, a couple of British soldiers could take on a couple hundred Chinese soldiers because of the weapons that were produced by the Industrial Revolution. And the Brits were marksmen. They were military specialists. War was an art for them, and they were good at it. Yeah, as an American, I might say we kicked them out, but the truth is they were thousands of miles from home, and we way outnumbered them. So it was kind of embarrassing that it took America that long to kick out the Brits, because we outnumbered them so much, and we had home court advantage. They were a military machine worthy of respect. And the merchants knew that. And they knew that if the Chinese picked this battle, it would be one that they would lose. And in losing, they would be forced to give up all of these different lands and things that the merchants wanted. It was no time at all. No time at all. That China was basically beaten down and humiliated, given a spanking by the British Empire. That was the first kind of international big humiliation. The real humiliating part was the ease that Britain did it with. I mean, Britain had so many ships and interests. They still had people, in the Americas, in the Caribbean. They still had people in South America. They had people in all over different parts of Asia, India, Middle East, Africa. I mean, this little small island was dispersed all over the world. There was only a small fraction of their military that was actually engaging China. And that little small fraction bent China over their knee and tanned their hide red. This was an embarrassment. And this embarrassment sticks with China today. Out of that, what happened is the Brits easily defeated the emperor, who was supposed to be the son of God, was forced to sign, the Chinese were forced to sign a treaty of Nanking, the first of what the Chinese later called the Unequal Treaties, and it was. Sorry, you don't get an equal treaty if you lose in a war. If you wanted an equal treaty, you come with the treaty, signatory before the war. If you're defeated, then it's going to suck for you as the one that was defeated. That's to the victor go the spoils. So it's understandable. So The treaty, which was completely unfair because Britain had to fight and they won, and so they put the screws to China, it granted the UK power and freedom of territory of Britain over Chinese land. Chinese had to hand over Hong Kong. That's when, and China wasn't so concerned about it. They thought, okay, Hong Kong at that time in the mid 1800s was a fishing village. Who cared? But Hong Kong was brilliant. It was perfectly situated. It was more than just a fishing village. It had amazing natural ports that were needed to bring in ships that were bringing opium to China and bringing supplies from China back to Europe. This is when we started HSBC. This is when banking started between Hong Kong, Shanghai, and England. This is the big trade that began to take place, and trade boomed. Money boomed. It was wild. I mean, it was like the Wild West. There was money to be made hand over fist. Trade started with Europe, China, Japan, Philippines. Hong Kong was at the center of it all. Everybody was making money except for the Chinese, because the money and the power no longer belonged to Beijing, belonged to London. If you wanted access, if you were a foreign importer from America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Japan, and you wanted to come into China and do your trade or buy something or move something, you didn't go to the Chinese for permission. You went to the Brits. The Chinese watched their country and their waters taken over by a foreign power, and it was humiliating. The money and the power were no longer in Beijing, and it caused a lot of problems. And the more that Britain controlled, the more opium just rolled straight into the country. So the Brits just kept supplying the opium and the Chinese kept supplying the goods. Chinese were addicted. Opium dens started up all over the place, and Chinese were useless crack addicts. They didn't want to fight, they didn't want to work, they didn't want to do anything but smoke opium all day long. In the beginning, opium kind of started as this wealthy community, this kind of high-end club, where wealthy families that were connected to Western leaders would, dabble with it. But later, everybody connected with China, from craftsmen to merchants to entertainers, servants, women, Buddhist monks, nuns, Taoist priests. Everyone took up the habit and openly bought and equipped themselves with the latest smoking instruments of smoking opium. Finally, China just became addicted. This led to an unbearable situation in China because the emperor knew and the leadership knew that if we are to get out of this mess, we have to beat out the Brits. So they launched a second war against the Brits. And this time when the Brits came, they came with the French. Because more people were interested in China now, not just Britain. It didn't take long for other Europeans to start flexing their muscle inside of China. When the Brits came on the second Opium War, they actually just started bombing what's known as the Summer Palace, the old Summer Palace. So there's two Summer Palaces in Beijing, or just outside of Beijing. One that's destroyed and one that's not. The one that's not is one all the tourists go to. The one that is destroyed or was destroyed by the Brits. I remember when I was living in Beijing, I took a group of students there, and I didn't know any history at all. So I just started making stuff up. And I said, this location right here is what was called the Emperor's Last Stand. And I began this story about how the emperor stood his ground. The emperor wasn't even there when it was being bombed. I later learned, but there was a group of secondary students in China that got this whole lecture from me about Emperor's Last Stand because I was supposed to say something. I didn't know what to say, so I made up a few things. I later learned that this was during the Second Opium War that Summer Palace was destroyed, razed to the ground, another humiliating defeat. But this time, the treaty was even worse. Of course, if you wanted a better treaty, again, like I said, you have to make those treaties when you have footing, leverage. The Chinese had no leverage, only humiliation. Britain demanded to have the most favored nation status, and that included opening all of China to British merchant companies, legalizing the opium trade, exempting foreign import taxes on British goods, permission for the British Empire the British ambassador to reside in Beijing, and for the English language to be the first version to be taken for all the treaties and would take precedence over all the treaties over the Chinese language. So if there's any conflict in the translation, the English language translation would be the dominant translation. That then led to the Boxer Rebellion, which I've done in other podcasts, which was a multinational alliance that involved primarily 8 nations in the beginning and then several nations afterwards. Several nations came and got involved. Britain, Russia, Japan, France, Germany, USA, Italy, Austria, Netherlands, Belgium, and Spain, just for good measure, moved in and started taking their piece of the pie inside of China. China was humiliated, and the entire world was there to watch. The Chinese government officials that were in charge during the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars were executed. China had to pay tens of billions of dollars in these every year fees that were forced to give up land to foreign nations. Chinese had to watch foreigners come in and demand that Chinese do this and that and this and that in a country that was theirs. They were this proud empire, and now they've been cut to ashes, shown for, made fun of for being stupid, ignorant, poor, backwards. Remember that, because this is the beginning of the modern China that we see today. This is the period that I want to refer to, because everything you see in China, and it may not make sense right now. You might think, wow, you took a really long time to kind of get to where you're at, to be able to explain. Please just get to the point. I'm done with the history lesson. Trust me. What I've just said paves the road for what is taking place today. When I saw the connection, I was like, oh, I have to share this. I have to share this with our audience, because I believe that these are the things that God points out for us to know as believers as we pray for the Chinese underground house church and move forward with the future of missions. So when we look at free trade in China, nope, they want nothing to do with it. Foreigners in China, nope, the government wants nothing to do with it. Drugs in China, they want nothing to do with it. Why don't they want anything to do with free trade? Because when they think of free trade, they start hearing the language of the occupiers, the imperialists that came and took over their country and humiliated them. The Brits, the Germans, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Americans, the Japanese. Everybody came and took a piece of the pie from China. They took their pound of flesh. And Chinese probably thought there'll be a day we will get retribution. When they hear the word free trade today, they think about the free trade that happened during the Opium Wars. When they think of foreigners, the Communist Party points to the foreigners that occupied China from the Opium Wars. They point to Hong Kong, Guangdong, Shanghai, Nanking, the Nanking massacres, drugs. This is where it gets good. Because when you look at the dark history of Wuhan, you're going to find that what the rest of the world did to China, China is now doing to the rest of the world. Christianity, they want no part of it. Why? Because those that came in and occupied China, those that came in and these imperial armies began to build these colonization, or these colonies. And you have the colonial architecture that starts to take place and build up these areas that become wealthy because of the opium and the trade that's taking place. And the missionaries, when they go to China, begin to become a part of this system. So when the Chinese hear the message of the Christian missionaries, when they see the Christian missionaries in action, they associate them with colonialization and opium. But it's not just that. Oh, it gets so weird. It gets so strange. Something happens in China that most of you that are listening, probably, even if you're a Chinese historian, you may not be aware of. You may not be aware of this rebellion that took place between the Opium Wars. So while the Opium Wars were taking place, there was also a civil war. A civil war that was called it's often referred to as a rebellion, but it was more than a rebellion. A rebellion makes it sound like somebody's going up against, a little group that's going up against a big established government. No. The Taiping Rebellion was a Chinese civil war. And it was bad, guys. Guys, you might have never heard of the Taiping Rebellion, but it was one of the bloodiest battles in all of Chinese history. It ranks as one of the bloodiest battles in all of human history, and it is the bloodiest civil war that has ever taken place. And it was the bloodiest conflict to take place in the 19th century. What happened? There was a man by the name of Hong Xiuquan who believed that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. So you see how Chinese start to see Christianity? So Hong was this, he was this guy. He's from a poor mountain village. He's from a people group called the Hakka, which is a type of Han Chinese. And he wanted to become a government official, but you had to take tests during those times. And he failed the test. So he went back home. He fell sick. He was bedridden for several days. And he began to have these mystical visions. This is kind of how Mormonism started. This is how Islam started. He started to have these visions. And after these visions, he received a missionary tract from Christian Protestant missionaries. And after reading it carefully, he declared that he now understood that his vision meant that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And God had sent him to China to rid it of the devils, including the corrupt Qing dynasty, which was in charge at the time. And Hong didn't know that much about Jesus. He didn't know that much about Christianity. He only had a tract in his hand. So Hong made his way down to modern day Guangzhou, where he met a American Baptist missionary, Southern Baptist missionary by the name of Issachar Roberts. And Issachar Roberts shared a tract with him and began to share with him. But after listening just to Hong share a little bit, said, no, dude. Sorry, but what you're reading, what you're understanding is all wrong, son. That's not what the Bible says. You are not a younger brother of Jesus Christ. In the spiritual world, you're a child of the King. In the spiritual world, you become a part of the family of God. But by blood, dude, you are not the younger brother of Jesus Christ. But Hong said he was. And this Southern Baptist missionary refused to baptize him and said that, he and those small followers that are beginning to follow him were bent on making their religious ideas serve their religious purposes. Or political purposes. They were bent on making their religious ideas serve their political purposes. That's a direct quote from Issachar Roberts, the missionary in Guangzhou. So Hong started to do these like tent meetings. He was a very charismatic speaker and he built up a huge following. Went into Guangxi, which is a western province of China, began to preach and got this huge following. And he started this group called the God Worshipping Society. That's the translation of it into English. The God Worshipping Society. And this God worshiping society believed a really freaky version of Jesus Christ, which wasn't really Christianity, but it was a mix between Taoism, Confucianism, millennialism, and Christianity. And Hong presented this as a restoration of the ancient Chinese faith of Shangdi, the god of Shangdi, which I've talked about many times on other podcasts. And he basically developed a new religion that fell under this god worshiping society. And Hong had two other freak shows that joined him. One was a guy by the name of Yang Shuqing, who began to speak on behalf of God the Father, and another guy by the name of Xiao Chao Gui, which began to speak on the behalf of Jesus Christ. So you had the Trinity with these three guys, all of them speaking for a different part of the head. Now keep in mind, the Bible had not even been really fully translated and passed around in the Chinese language. So these guys are just kind of flying off the seat of their pants. And because they didn't have a Bible in their own translation, Hong started working on his own translation that's called the Taiping Bible. And he translated his own Bible. And on January 11th, 1851, Hong declared himself the heavenly king of a heavenly kingdom of peace, which is where we get the English name Taiping for the heavenly kingdom. And this is where we see him raise an army with trained fighters to begin to fight. And we're looking at about 30 million people died. That's like almost half the number of all the people that died during World War II. And in World War II, we had people fighting on every continent. You had people fighting in the Middle East, people fighting in Europe, people fighting in Asia theater, people fighting in America, people fighting in Africa. Everybody was fighting, everybody was dying. And it only is twice the number of people that died during the Taiping Rebellion. That's how big the Civil War was. And at the same time, you have this mass humiliation. So I want you to just take a pause. All the information that I've shared, it might kind of all bunch together in your mind. It might sound like a lot, but look at it this way. China has a foreign power in their country occupying their land. At the same time, they have a guy who claims to be this crazy Jesus Christ brother that they don't even know who Jesus is. And that leads to a civil war that brings about 70 million people. And the foreigners bring in drugs, along with missionaries, take over land and humiliate the country. Is it any wonder the Chinese are just a bit cautious of Christianity and missionaries in their country? Dude, what happened with the Taiping Rebellion was evil. This civil war would have gone actually towards, we might even be calling China the kingdom of heaven right now, had it not been for the fact that Hong got a little carried away and decided to go and step into Shanghai. That brought the Brits in. The Brits weren't having it. They smacked down the Taiping Rebellion pretty quickly, went into Nanking area, surrounded the area, cut it off from its food supplies. They were starving to death. Hong thought that God was going to send manna from heaven like he did to the Israelites when they were in the desert, but it never happened. So he began to pick weeds up off the ground, some of which were poisonous, and he died of being poisoned by eating that poison. Now, when were the foreigners kicked out of China? When did the Chinese stop paying this humiliating duty that was given all the time? When were the foreigners no longer allowed to have free reign inside of China? Sadly, when Mao Zedong came on board. He kicked out the foreigners. He got rid of foreign influence. He got rid of businesses that were there to exploit the Chinese and take advantage of them. He got rid of the drug traders and the opium dens. He made Chinese productive again until he didn't. He was destructive, but he also did a big favor for the Chinese by giving them their country again. Now, you might not think that the Opium Wars that I just described to you have anything to do with China today and what we're seeing with protests in your city. But it does. It so does. You have no idea how these two are related. I've got one word: how today is related to yesterday. Opium. You see, not too long ago, the major narcotic provider for the United States was South America. But then the cartels had trouble during the drug wars, and the cost of their production increased. The production was not as big of a problem as it was just growing the stuff. I mean, growing was needed for the South Americans to be able to make the kind of drugs that were needed for the market in North America. And in order to do the kind of growing that they needed acreage. And acreage could be seen from the air, not just from flyover flights, but also from satellites. So anything that was significant at all would be seen from the air by the American government, and the American government could send in CIA agents to basically declare war and take over any area that was growing the type of drugs, narcotics that were needed on the ground. So the cartels then shifted from narcotics to opioids, and they found a major opioid grower for the precursor of the heroin production in Afghanistan. And that served the purpose for quite a while up until 2001. That's when you had 9/11. That might ring a bell for some people. And then after 2001, the market was getting tighter and more competitive once Afghanistan was no longer on the market, until a major player came into the market to provide the drugs needed for North America: China. There was another player as well, is quite big, and I've talked about them in other podcasts, and that is North Korea. You see, the North Koreans are gangster drug runners. In 2001 alone, North Korea brought in over $1 billion in profit from the illegal drug trade. This is all run from a podcast that I did last week about a room that's called Room 39. Room 39 runs all of the illegal business of North Korea. And Room 39, they do slavery. You want to talk about modern day slavery? North Koreans still do human trafficking, slavery, drugs, counterfeit money. All of that is run from Room 39. But North Korea is not the player of the Chinese. It was at this time, after Afghanistan was kind of taken off the table, that China really got involved in the opium trade. And they started to really become a major player in a little drug called fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is 80 to 100 times stronger than morphine. Fentanyl is added to heroin, cocaine, other drugs to increase its potency. It can be so potent, it can be deadly. I mean, this is how Prince died. This is how other well-known movie stars, rappers, singers have died, because their stuff has been laced with fentanyl. Many users believe that they are purchasing heroin when they're actually purchasing something that is laced with a powerful fentanyl. And that often has resulted in deadly overdose. If you go to anyone and you ask them, hey, what nation, do it as a little experiment. Ask anybody on the street, in your church, in your Bible study, who do you think is the largest producer of drugs in the world? Like hardcore narcotics. Mexico? Nope. Colombia? Nope, not even close. Nicaragua? Nope. Amateurs. You're all amateurs. You all been watching Narcos on Netflix, because only people in the know would say China. China is the biggest drug runner in the world. Fentanyl, the street name. If you look at the street name for fentanyl, for those that are gangsta and know what I'm talking about, you would know that the street name is China Girl, Chinatown, China White. According to the DEA.gov, so you can go to the DEA's website and get the information that I'm going to be supplying on here. But according to the DEA.gov, China is the #1 supplier of fentanyl in the USA. Fentanyl also comes from Mexico, but it didn't originate in Mexico. It doesn't come from Mexico. It's shipped into Mexico from China. Mexico is used as a drop-off point to smuggle the drugs into the country from original delivery from China. And America's hooked. It is the most deadly drug in the United States. It's something I've been hit by personally. It's hit my family. This is why maybe this story takes a bit of a personal turn for me, because I can see this from a personal side. Every day, at least 180 people die from drug overdose. 8 people will die during just the time that I'm making this podcast from drugs that come from China. And it's not just the big cities. Big cities are completely hooked. But now China has pimps pimping their drugs, even in the rural farm town areas of middle America. Guys, my hometown is a farm town. My hometown had one street light and it blinked. My hometown is, the closest town is a little bitty small town in nowhere, Indiana, smack dab in the middle of Indiana. And I lived on a cornfield. I have a cousin. Got completely hooked. Started stealing from family members. Started stealing from his own mom. Anything that he could steal and sell, he would do. I come from a step family where my uncles are about my age. And so my uncles, cousins, we all kind of grew up the same age together. Cousin got completely hooked, homeless, living with my uncle at one point, ends up stealing checks, writing them secretly to be cashed, to be sold, to get his hands on these opioids, synthetic opioids. But it's not just China that's producing these opioids. There's one city in particular that produces the majority of all fentanyl that is on the streets in America. Anyone want to guess what that city is? It's the focus of this podcast. Wuhan. Wuhan is the fentanyl capital of the world. And in case you haven't been, in case you haven't been listening, in case you've been living in a cave for the last 6 months, Wuhan is ground zero for COVID-19. When Wuhan shut down, the fentanyl gravy train stopped. It's a big loss of money for China. You see, fentanyl is easier to make and smuggle into the United States than heroin, and it's far more profitable to sell. 1 kilo of fentanyl bought in China for about $3,000 to $5,000 US can generate 1.5 million US dollars. Show me any stock on the US stock exchange, on the New York stock market that gives you those kind of returns. And I'll show you a line outside longer than anything you've ever seen in your life. Fentanyl is 30 times more potent than heroin. They say that if you take fentanyl even one time, heroin no longer works for you to get high. It's like taking water. In the last 4 years alone, there's been a shocking increase in America for the increase of fentanyl because it's been flooded. The market's been flooded. China's been sending fentanyl to the US in large quantities. It's now the number one drug in America. Cocaine, heroin, all these other drugs are on a downward spiral. Fentanyl, skyrocketing. But now because of COVID-19, Wuhan being shut down, the main source of this fentanyl drug is being cut off. And now we're seeing cartels in South America freaking out because they don't have a supplier. You see, here's the thing to understand. China doesn't actually make all of the fentanyl that is needed on the streets in America. Instead, what they do is they put together these kits. They're like IKEA kits. China's like IKEA for drugs. Drug runners on cartels, they go shopping at IKEA, they buy what they need, they get it home, they take it out of the box, and it's up to them to assemble it for it to work. So this is kind of like China's version of Breaking Bad. They got their RV parked outside of Mexico, and they're running their little chemical plants inside these little mobile units in South America so they can get their drugs into, and it's not just America. It's Canada. It's Eastern Europe. I mean, take a look at Estonia, Lithuania. the numbers that they've had to deal with when it comes to their war on fentanyl. Look at what the UK is going through right now. All of that coming from China. All of that coming from Wuhan. And the drug business is not done. It's far from being done. You see, you might have this idea. Maybe you've been watching some drug show on Netflix or some movie, and you're thinking of these underground operators that are running, marijuana or cocaine from remote farms in Vietnam or in the Golden Triangle. Nope, that's not what's going on in Wuhan. In Wuhan, you have high-rise structures, office buildings, cubicles, workers with pension plans, retirement plans, working in the middle of the city with friendly customer service. How would you like your fentanyl? And it's as clear as day what's happening. And in fact, the US government put pressure on the Chinese government to knock it off. Chinese government said, what? No, what? What are you talking about? We haven't done anything. There's no drug. You're the ones with the drug problem. And we're back in the 1830s, where the Chinese dens were full of drug users, and Britain was supplying them with their drugs. Now, Westerners are in their quote unquote modern day opium dens. And it's the Chinese that are now providing the drugs and taking advantage of the countries economically. You see, the drug business inside of China is not done in an RV in the Mojave Desert somewhere in California. It's done in office complexes, cubicles with tax incentives and Chinese government rebates. You basically get a coupon when you sell drugs to another country, and you take your coupon to the local government office and they give you money back. There's incentives for selling drugs. It's not outlawed. It's encouraged. These drugs are not illegal in China because China doesn't have a problem with them. Just like Britain didn't have a problem with opium during the opium trade. Full circle, baby. When you look at the drugs that are arriving from China into the United States, do you know where those drugs are coming from? Mexico. You know who is the biggest opponent to Trump building a wall on the southern border with Mexico? The Chinese. They don't want a wall going up between Mexico and America any more than anybody else that is protesting against the wall. Even more so, they have a lot of money to lose from it. But the lack of supply with Wuhan being down has led to the drugs now being more expensive. The price for fentanyl has jumped over 50% and expected to go even higher. But a lot of lives are being saved right now because we are seeing a hyper decoupling timeline taking place that detaches the US economy from the Chinese economy. And President Trump, whether you like him or not, has taken this personal. For those of you that don't know, President Trump does not drink alcohol, never touches the stuff. And it's personal. There's a personal reason why. And you're going to hear about this a lot in the next couple months. You're getting it here first and you're getting it here early. The reason why is because Trump lost his brother, Fred, due to alcohol addiction. Now, why are you going to hear about that? I mean, he's been president now for almost 4 years. Most people know that he doesn't drink alcohol. They kind of make fun of him for it. And he doesn't drink alcohol because his brother died of alcoholism. His brother was an addict. And so whenever Trump sees addicts, drug addicts, alcohol addicts, it doesn't matter. He has a soft spot. He said that himself. I'm going to be reading from a speech that he said himself. But the reason you're going to hear about that is because his older brother, Fred, had a daughter. Her name was Mary. Mary Trump is just published a tell-all book that she called what is it called? Too Much and Never Enough. How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. It's about Donald Trump. Too much and never enough. How my family created the world's most dangerous man. She blames Trump for the death of her father, who died of alcoholism, saying, quote, Donald, following the lead of my grandfather and with the complicity, silence, and inaction of his siblings, destroyed my father. I can't let him destroy my country. Maybe Trump does feel like he could do something more, because she goes on to talk about an event that was very personal to him. And I remember listening to it live. It took place in 2017. Soon after he became president, he made a major speech in which he declared the opioid crisis in America a public health emergency and mobilized all funds that he could for a federal emergency. Trump was able to free up considerable resources to help the people and communities fight the addiction to opioids. He said this. I'm going to read a little bit from his speech because I think it's very important for you to directly connect it to what we are seeing with the riots in the streets today. He said this: 175 lives are lost in America per day. That's 7 lost lives per hour in our country. Drug overdoses are now the leading cause of unintentional death in the United States by far. More people are dying from drug overdoses today than from gun homicides and motor vehicles combined. Think of it. Motor vehicle crashes, gun homicides, more people by far from drug overdoses. These overdoses are driven by a massive increase in addiction to prescription painkillers, heroin, and other opioids. Last year, 1 million Americans used heroin, and more than 11 million used unprescripted opioids. The United States is by far the largest consumer of these kind of drugs, using more opioids per person than any other country by far in the world. Opioid overdose deaths have quadrupled since 1999 and now account for the majority of all fatal drug overdoses. Who would have thought? No part of our society, not young or old, rich or poor, urban or rural, has been spared this plague of drug addiction and this horrible situation that's taking place with opioids. And then he goes on to say, what happens if we do our jobs? How the number of drug users and the addicted will start to tumble downward over a period of years. It will be a beautiful thing to see. I learned myself, and this is when Trump starts to get more personal. I learned myself, I had a brother, Fred, great guy, best looking guy, best personality, much better than mine, but he had a problem. He had a problem with alcohol. And he would tell me, don't drink, don't drink. He was substantially older than me, and I listened to him and I respected him. But he would constantly tell me not to drink. He would also add, don't smoke, but he would say it over and over again. And to this day, I've never had a drink. I have no longing for it. I have no interest in it. To this day, I've never had a cigarette. Don't worry, those are only 2 of my good things. I don't want to tell you about the bad things. There are plenty of bad things too, but he really helped me. I had somebody that guided me, and he had a very, very tough life because of alcohol. Believe me, very tough life. He was a strong guy, but it was a tough, tough thing that he was going through. I learned because of Fred. I learned. And that's what I think is so important. This was an idea that I had where if we had to teach young people not to take drugs, just not to take them. When I see friends of mine that are having difficulty with not having that drink at dinner, that's literally almost impossible for them to stop. I say to myself, I can't even understand it. Why would that be difficult? But we understand why it's difficult. The fact is, if we can teach people, and people generally, not to start, it's really, really easy not to take them. And I think that that's going to end up being the most important thing. Really tough, really big, really great advertising. So we get people before they start, so they don't have to go through these problems that other people are going through. We've already started distributing nearly $1 billion in grants for addicted prevention and treatment, and $50 million in support of law enforcement programs to assist those facing prison and facing addiction. And we also have launched $81 million partnership to research better pain management techniques for our incredible veterans. So this was kind of the first big touch and go where these programs were launched. And then this led to prison rehabilitation, where those that were in jail for taking or using drugs were put instead on rehabilitation programs instead of punishment in jail. But what we have seen is a flood that has come in from Wuhan. And I feel that this is closely related to Chinese history in a way that is important for people to understand that the battles that we are seeing in our cities are coming partly from these addicted communities that are now seeing a challenge with supplying what they need on the ground. When I look at what we are facing right now inside of China, I've seen China take the approach, and this has been a big part of the America-China trade agreement as well. In fact, President Trump said that he would not sign the trade agreement until China agreed to stop the fentanyl inflow into America. It was a cornerstone of the trade agreement. And China said, "What? What drug? What are you talking about? We're not sending any drugs into America, but if we were, we'll stop. We're not, but if we were, we would stop." It stopped anyway. When COVID-19 hit in January, it took everybody by surprise. The supply chain was not ready for that breakdown. So in many ways, as bad as we've seen COVID-19, one of the good things has been the stopping of opioids, synthetic opioids, going into other countries around the world, snuffing out the lives of young people because of drug overdoses. But I think that this gives us a little bit of insight into the Chinese government's mindset that sees trade, free trade, as an enemy, that sees foreigners and the way that foreigners operate as the enemy, that sees Christian missionaries as the enemy. So when you start to see this information about the drug trade coming from Wuhan into America, come from Wuhan into Canada, come from Wuhan into Eastern Europe, into Western Europe, into countries around the world, when you start seeing that on the news, don't hate the Chinese. When you start seeing their persecution against the Christians, don't hate the Chinese. When you start seeing their anger against the Chinese or Western missionaries in China, don't hate the Chinese. The enemy has erased the good history and is reinforcing the bad. The enemy has lied to his captives. The communist government inside of China are captives, captive to a lie. The decisions that they make in ignorance. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. As supporters of Back to Jerusalem, I am asking you, I'm begging you, I'm pleading with you. Tonight with your family, this Sunday with your church, this weekend with your Bible study groups, please, please, please get on your knees. Cry out with passion before the Father and pray for the church inside of China. Pray for the government leaders. Pray for President Xi. Though the government leaders have been attacking the church, they're not the enemy. For our battles are not with flesh and blood, but with spirits, powers, and principalities in dark places. May it be on earth as we see in heaven. May the battles be first won in the spiritual realm before we see the physical manifestation in the present life that we live. Pray, pray, pray for the church in China. Pray for the government in China. And you might be listening to this thinking, pray for China. Dude, are you not watching the news? Look at what's happening in our country. Look what's happening in America. Look what's happening in New York. Look what's happening in London. Look what's happening in Australia. Look what's happening in my own nation. How can I pray for your nation when my house is on fire? Because the enemy wants to distract you. You have the capacity to do both. You have the capacity to pray for your nation as well as for China, and it's in your interest. If China falls to the hands of the enemy, and China's influence is all around the world, the enemy's influence will thus be all around the world. With Wuhan rising back again and going back into the drug business and providing opiates, synthetic opiates for all the rest of the world, everybody suffers. But it's not as easy to produce drugs when revival is happening. It's not easy to be the enemy and working in the enemy's hands when revival fires are burning through the countryside. Pray for China like you've never prayed before, because there is a tsunami of revival that we believe will continue on from China into Eastern or Western Asia, Asia Minor, into the Middle East, all the way back to Jerusalem, until all the nations, all the tribes, all the ethnic groups will have heard the good news of Jesus Christ. And then the end will come. I'm sorry that I spent such a long time, an hour, going over a history lesson. I apologize that I went through things that I know most people find extremely boring. And after you listen, you probably want to vomit, but it's absolutely imperative that we expose the enemy's tricks that he's done in the past so we can be ready for them in the future. It is absolutely imperative that we expose the game plan of the enemy from the past. Why do you think the Bible is so important for us as saints? Not just the New Testament, but the Old Testament, to show the cycle of how the enemy has come against man over and over again to stop him from fulfilling the gospel that Jesus Christ has called us to fulfill. Why do you think the enemy has attacked so hard? Because he knows that his time is limited. The enemy knows that the moment that every tribe and nation has heard the good news of Jesus Christ, his day of roaming and having power on the earth will come to an end. And he's trying to extend that for as long as possible. And that is why he's trying to keep us from fulfilling our destiny. Because if we fulfill the reason why we were created, we will bring the good news of Jesus Christ to all the people, and then the end will come. Christ will return, and the enemy will be forever bound. The enemy wants to keep from being forever bound. So he is roaming the earth and trying to stop it. And the way that he stops it is he attacks your home. Because if he attacks your home, he will take your eyes off of the goal. If he can take your eyes off of the goal, you will not be focused on missions. I'm telling you, missions is even more important than your own life. Missions is even more important than your own nation. Missions and completing the Great Commission is what we have been tasked to do. It is the very last words that are recorded that come from the mouth of Jesus, that roll off of his lips, that we are to go out and share the gospel to all the earth. And then the end will come. If you want to see the return of Jesus Christ, if you want to see the end come, if you believe that there is injustice, you're going to pray for the Lord to return. If you believe that there is unrighteousness, you're going to pray for the Lord to return. If you believe that there is suffering in this world, you're going to pray for the Lord to return. If you believe that we can obtain justice ourselves, if you believe that we can attain righteousness ourselves, if you believe that we can build a government that will make everything nice and better, then you won't necessarily look for the return of Christ, because you believe that you can make it better on earth now today. But I believe that every mechanism given to man in man's hands alone is an absolute disaster, and it equally spreads misery to everybody. The only way that we can bring about justice, peace, love, and everlasting righteousness is for the Lord to return again. That's it. His blood was shed for us so that we can be with him for eternity. Hell is hot. Satan hates it. He doesn't want to go there, and I don't either. So he's going to try to delay it for as long as possible. So if the history lesson seems a little bit much, if it dragged on for too long, I apologize. If you made it to the very end of this podcast, congratulations. I pray that you can see the connection between the dark past of Wuhan and what's happening in the world today, and how COVID-19 might be responsible for many deaths, but it also might be responsible for saving many lives. I want to thank you for joining us for this Back to Jerusalem podcast. I want to thank you for your prayers, your support, and I pray God blesses you during this time.